Hello, friends, and welcome to the City of the Immaculata, a place where we discuss various topics of history and theology. If you enjoy these videos, please like, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing or sharing the video with others. Thank you so much. Today's lecture is The Road to 1054, a history. This is the beginning of a two-part series on the events that lead up to the Schism of 1054, when the Roman legates and the Patriarch of Constantinople dropped mutual excommunications on one another. This video today that we'll be looking at is going to be the first part. The second part will be the fight for the faith. Today, in this first part, we're looking at the fight for land. It's not going to be easy to completely extract one part from the other. As with all historical events, the themes are interwoven. And in this lecture, you'll find hints of the second in the first, and in the second, you'll have the context of the land disputes in your mind, which will, I believe, help you make sense of why some of the seemingly minute details of theology would be so caught up in the geopolitics of its day. I do believe that when you finish this series of lectures on 1054, you will walk away with a much better perspective of why it happened, the significance of the event itself, as opposed to just some of the isolated discussions around 1054 that we unfortunately see so often in others. A few points to consider. I did not intend for this to be an apologetics work. While I believe that Christians aren't absolved from the events of geopolitics, we also don't believe that land disputes between empires or provinces should be an excuse for furthering schism, and that's certainly not my intent with any of the lectures in this series that we're going to be covering on Orthodoxy. The covering of the land disputes here is, again, to give the proper context to why the relations had so deteriorated that something that's basically the in many ways the idiosyncratic grievances of two men could how could they ever cause a 1,000-year rupture? Also, while the Great Schism is fascinating in its own right, my own interests are more in the trajectory of the West. And in order to tell you how we get there, this event is, of course, an important detail with all of the proper context of the event itself. And then my goal is to eventually cover some of the wider areas of the scope of the trajectory of the West moving into the High Middle Ages. And this will be going up to the moment of the mutual excommunications, but we're not going to be reviewing their legality, who schismed from whom, all of these kinds of things that have honestly just been rehashed over and over ad nauseum. I find that those debates, while they could be helpful if people had the full context of the entire story, oftentimes it's just an exercise in futility. considering that most of the people that are listening to these lectures don't have, listening to those debates, don't have this full context. So I'm not so interested in that. There's plenty of other people that have done that. There is shelves of books that have been filled on the issue of the legality and the causes of the schism itself from the moment of the summer of 1054. But I want to cover everything that leads up to that moment, mostly. And this lecture today will be going through a geopolitical interpretation of the events that lead us to 1054, which I think you guys are going to find very fascinating and will help you, especially as we, move closer to the next lecture and we go through some of the specific theological disputes that were at play then. Now, as you guys know, when I do these lectures, the question for every historian is where to begin. Do I begin back at the garden in Adam and Eve and work my way forward? That's how you would do proper history if we were going to be truthful, but we always just kind of have to pick a point and get started from there. But, you always have to realize, of course, that you're dropping yourself in the middle of the ocean and you're sort of finding your way forward from that point. You're not actually beginning at the beginning, but I do want to walk very briefly from antiquity to the events of the High Middle Ages on a sort of macro level that we'll be entering here so that you have a good perspective of where we're at in history. And a good starting point, I figured as any would be with Diocletian. So very briefly, the Roman Empire by the 4th century is becoming harder and harder to govern for one man. There are invasions along numerous borders, and despite the magnificence of Roman roads, it is still too far, too wide, too dispersed to communicate effectively and coordinate effective responses in real time to events as they're taking place. So Emperor Diocletian divides the empire into four parts known as the Tetrarchy system, where you have two senior emperors known as the Augusti and two junior emperors known as the Caesars. Diocletian gets in history books, you'll see a lot of people that give him a hard time about this because things turn out so bad, but it wasn't a terrible idea in and of itself, but events proved themselves too much for this to work at the time. Rival claimants ended up battling over who would rule what area and what the borders of those areas would be and these sorts of things. It kind of unravels the whole thing. Eventually, Constantine wins out as the sole ruler, uniting the empire once again. But while Constantine intends to rule a unified empire, he does begin the process, or excuse me, I guess I should say he continues the process of compartmentalizing the empire into four governable parts, basically along the Diocletian lines, which is why they ended up keeping his name and become known as dioceses. Now, in another sort of shrewd political move, to avoid regional conflict growing in Rome, Constantine shifts the capital east to a city, and again, another shrewd move, a city that he names after himself, Constantinople. And this would be of course, one of the great medieval cities that is practically born overnight. Now, Constantine's successors, in the first and Valens, would again rule the empire in halves, and this results loosely in this two-part empire. And even when there are moments of unification, even when there are moments where the divisions and the ruptures are healed, the idea and praxis becomes solidified over time more and more into this idea of the Eastern and Western halves. I mean, you end up with two capitals. You have the so-called New Rome, which is going to be the capital of the eastern half of the empire. As well, you have Rome herself, the Eternal City, the city with this prestige and this ancient history. It's not just going to disappear from the map. So, because of that, what in effect happens is you end up with the people seeing them as having two capitals of the two halves of the empire. As well, you end up with two languages. More and more, you end up with a Greek speaking East and a Latin speaking West. You have a single religion, but one that finds itself over time in isolation from the other. And this isolation, as the would come into contact with each other, would more and more end up leading to conflict. All of this would have gone on indefinitely, but then in the 406, the Danube froze and waves of barbarians began crossing into Roman Gaul. The Romans were dealing with a lot of issues at this point. Anyways, it was becoming harder and harder to maintain a Roman military. They relied more and more on mercenaries. And so this begins this cascading series of Gothic tribes pushing further and further and further into the empire, with Rome attempting over time, somewhat successfully for what it's worth, to absorb these barbarian tribes into the empire. But then in 476, King Ottokar sacks Rome, bringing the western half of the empire into a period of disarray. Now, this instability was momentarily reversed when the Eastern Emperor Justinian, in his use of a very brilliant general Belisarius, brings his force into Rome, into the Italian peninsula. Now, Justinian had been eyeing the peninsula and the old capital from the beginning of his reign. All of the Eastern Empire, of the Byzantine Empire, as we would come to know it, would always want to have the old capital of Rome. It's just part of the historic prestige of an empire to have old Rome. Nobody then even would have referred to it as old Rome. That's actually a later moniker that's given to it. But in the minds of the people, and especially in the minds of the empire, you would want the city of Rome to be part of your jurisdiction. So Justinian sends out his great military leader, Belisarius. He begins reconquering, and what would not only be just an administrative victory, a military victory, but a theatrical one as well. Rome, as I was saying here, still loomed large in the minds of all Roman citizens, including those of Constantinople. So Belisarius invades in 565 in a really a very sweeping campaign, as you can see on the slides here. It's one of the great examples of military brilliance in history. As a matter of fact, the Belisarius's campaign in Italy. This begins a period of history known as the Byzantine captivity of the papacy, which I do plan to do a series on at some point. It's a worthwhile period of the papal history to discuss with you guys, but for now, it's just keep in mind that the Eastern Empire and the emperor himself would appoint the new pope, and very often he would be appointing them from among his own Greek-speaking clergy. So for many decades, the papacy was effectively Greek. The irony of this, though, of course, is as Eamon Duffy points out, that the period of the Byzantine captivity of the papacy, the Greek papacy, was one where the papacy actually, in many ways, comes into its own, and in a large degree, sort of firmly plants its prerogatives over and above those of the emperor in a way that the papacy, hadn't been able to do due to certain considerations of persecution and the inability to have that kind of leverage over the emperor up until that point. But for our lecture today, the important thing is that even though it would be pushed back after Belisarius, this establishes a permanent Byzantine presence in the Italian peninsula, in particular in the southern regions. Until that is the Norman invasion, which we will cover at length here in a bit. But realize for now that this is the situation taking place in southern Italy right as the events of 1054 get underway. Now, if you look on the left, the permanent establishment of the Byzantine Empire in Italy in the beginning of the 11th century, you'll see kind of two major areas right there with the Salerno kind of cutting through the middle of it, and then, a few other spots into the western coast of Italy. And that is a permanent occupation of the Byzantine Empire in southern Italy. And this will be the case until this period of the Norman invasion. But I want to focus for a moment before we cover that on some issues that are happening further east. Particularly this spot right here, right in the middle where the so-called borders between the two halves meet. Now, much like the situation playing out in southern Italy, this area will have long-term ramifications between the relations of East and West, both politically and religiously. Now, we've got a lot of maps that we'll be looking at here for the next few minutes, but I really want to drive home a few points. First off, this is where we're at for the time being, and this is where I want to kind of focus our attention. On the left of the vertical red line, you will see on one side a region known then as Illyricum or Pannonia, and on the right you will see Daciae. These are two on the dividing line between East and West, two of the major Praetorian prefectures. Now, technically, up until the ninth century, these would be loosely considered two halves of the same empire, right? Like, we're not talking about two different, officially two different empires at this point, but this line is important, and I took the liberty to superimpose over it a modern map to give you an idea of where we are. Now, in this slide, you can still make out the line fairly well. I just kind of wanted to bring out of focus a little bit the modern map just to give you an idea. So just keep in mind that red vertical line right there dropping down. And then the next slide here, I bring in the modern map a little bit more clearly, and you can kind of see what we're talking about here. I have on the left of that line, we will find modern day Croatia, Bosnia, a little bit of Montenegro, a little bit of Serbia, Belgrade kind of borders that, and then on the right, what would be the eastern half of the empire, you would find, Serbia, Kosovo, Macedonia, so on and so forth. And that's where we're at. That's where we're discussing as we look at this half between East and West. Basically, like it cuts through the middle of what would be known as the Balkans in the 20th century. And it's hard to snap a nice little map for you guys for the perfect context to kind of neatly walk you through up to 1054. The historical reality, as you can imagine, is always much more dynamic than a little snapshot of a map would allow you to assess. These borders are fluid. Many times they're unstable. They're subject to change very quickly. And as modern people, we are used to neat borders that will last decades, will last generations. But it's not so for the medievals. So all I'm trying to say is just take period maps with a grain of salt always. That said, I do find maps helpful. To give you an idea, this is a snapshot of Europe 932. We're a little bit of a century before we enter this period of 1054 that we're going to be leading up to. And I just want you to notice a few things here. Notice the Kingdom of Italy in the north. This is going to eventually be Yet another bane of papal existence with the Lombards. As well, we have the Papal States in purple. And then you see into the east, in the sort of dark burgundy red color, we have the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, as we would call it today. Then we have the Bulgarian Empire, and to the west of the Bulgarian Empire, we begin seeing the areas that we're going to be discussing today, which just be these areas of conflict all around that sort of central region of this map right here. And as always, whenever you're discussing medieval Byzantium, before we get too far, we have to keep in mind the wider picture. And of course, in the 6th century, they fought this terrible war of attrition against the Persian Sasanian Empire, only to find themselves engulfed in a new geopolitical struggle that no one saw coming when the Arabs emerged on camels out of the Arabian desert in the 7th and 8th century. That empire, the Islamic Caliphate, whether Arab or Turk, would become itself the bane of Byzantine existence for the rest of its future, for the rest of the Byzantine future. And we can see why. I mean, look at this map here. The Islamic conquest is in and of its own right just a overwhelming thing for the people of the time. And as you could see, it took a lot of the historic lands of Byzantium. Most of the southern the excuse me, most of the eastern Mediterranean and the north of Africa was part of the Byzantine Empire up to that point, and they effectively lost it overnight. Also remember too that the Byzantines had long been embroiled in terrible religious conflicts with those Christians who hadn't accepted the earlier Christian councils, especially those of Ephesus and Chalcedon. And this is going back a little bit far, but I do find that context helps people because those disputes had exhausted the physical, the mental, the spiritual goodwill of Christians of all sides of that dispute. And many Catholics are often taken aback at the sometimes deep-seated animosity that they find in some, I'll stress some, Eastern Christians towards those outside their communions. But if they had context of how, say, the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox were treating each other at this time, it makes much more sense. But that's just an aside. I just wanted to kind of give you guys, don't lose context of what's happening to the eastern half of the Byzantine, to the eastern half of the Eastern Empire. Now, I want to hone in here on Bulgaria and the rise of the Bulgarian Empire. In the same way that southern Italy would play such a prominent part in the schism, so too will Bulgaria. So let's spend a little bit of time with it here. Now, you may have noticed in that previous map of 932 that the Bulgarian Empire at this period is fairly massive empire for the time. Most of these are not massive land empires. They're pretty fragmented, and for the Bulgarians to create such a massive land empire was a pretty, phenomenal success of its day. They're often forgot about, but the Bulgarians were a fierce, formidable people. Now, in the mid ninth century, their ruler, Boris the First, is looking to convert to Christianity, and the reasons for that, he's seeking to consolidate his new empire under a single religion. And much like many of these rulers, be it Constantine, be it Charlemagne, be it Boris, we have to sort of look at them not just in the hagiographic sense, but also in the sense of what they're up against and what the success of having a unified religious identity for an empire does for the stability of a ruler is something that you certainly can't overestimate. Now, he initially makes a deal with the Latin Church, which would bring him under their jurisdiction. And you could see on the map with Croatia and the Frankish empires coming right up to their border right up to the border of Bulgaria, bringing his empire into the Western jurisdiction isn't a far-fetched idea. Though in his mind, it seems for Boris that the privilege of an autocephalous church from Constantine was his primary concern. Autocephaly meaning a church that it would be independent. It would not be under the jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Constantinople. This was something that weighed heavily on Boris. Interesting for you history buffs out there, especially if you're interested in theology. Boris sends a series of questions, remarkable questions, to the Roman Pontiff, Pope St. Nicholas the Great. And we have this wonderful reply from Nicholas, expounding upon which practices are essential, which are disciplinary, how to set up the episcopate, so on and so forth. It's a super fascinating exchange that we have the privilege to have access to as moderns. Unfortunately, all of this is undone when in 861 Byzantine Emperor Michael the Drunkard invades Bulgaria, forcing Boris to renege on his agreement with Rome as he's given certain pressures, we'll say, by the empire in the east to side with Constantinople over Rome. And this is really a beginning of a series of tensions that we'll see between Rome and Constantinople. We'll talk more about that specifically next week. But for now, I just would like to point out that Boris, he had always kind of oscillated back and forth between Rome and Constantinople, at times, quite effectively playing them against each other to his own advantage. But after the invasion by Michael the Drunkard of his land and the political pressures of the Byzantine Empire right on his front doorstep, it was kind of a foregone conclusion rather, which sphere of influence his church would fall to. And then in 689, unprepared to discuss the matter, a Latin delegation was thwarted and the Greek episcopate claimed Bulgaria for itself. And this was the beginning of, again, some of these tensious moments between Rome and Constantinople, where they are both claiming very similar things to one another, but it's going to have a lasting effect of how the two churches would come to view their own place and the place of the other within the church. Now, just for some context of where the papacy is during all of this that we've been talking about, and which we will continue to talk about, I have come up with this little timeline here, and I just wanted to point out like a few points to sort of make note of. So we have the fall of Rome in 476. We have Belisarius under the rule of Justinian the First coming in and conquering Italy in the 530s, and then that puts the papacy under this thing that we call the Byzantine papacy for several centuries, and that kind of that disintegrates, especially after the rise of Islam, and the East becomes very much caught up in its own mess. And then finally, of course, the papacy, seeking some kind of imperial protection, eventually turns to Charlemagne in the year 800. And then in Charlemagne, the Carolingian Empire disintegrates, and eventually born out of it is going to be the Holy Roman Empire, which would last all the way up into modernity. But for the meantime, the papacy sort of falls into this its own little insular period known as the pornocracy. And by 869, you've entered that period. Most historians today are calling it the Dark Ages of the papacy. More salaciously, we like to call it the pornocracy. And of that's going to last for a century. And eventually you're going to see the seeds of reform sort of begin coming into play here. But I wanted to give you guys this timeline so you can kind of see the stretch of what the major points are during the papal progression during this 500 or so years.
Hello, Catholic YouTube. Right now on our Patreon channel, patreon.com/City of the Immaculata. That's patreon.com/City of the Immaculata. You can find over 6 hours of lectures that we'll be releasing over the next few months on the errors of Eastern Orthodoxy. For just the $5 subscription, you will get The Road to 1054. Part 1, The Fight for Land. Part 2, The Fight for the Faith. The Azymes Controversy. Did the Orthodox concede the debate? Mehmed Cesaro Papism and the making of the Orthodox Church. Peter the Eleut, martyr or myth. Against the Latins, Orthodoxy as reactionism. Losky, Romanides, and the making of modern Orthodoxy. Again, for any of our paid tiers, you will receive over 6 hours of the most exhaustive Catholic responses to Eastern Orthodoxy anywhere online. Hit the link in the description.
The Empire strikes back. They are once again, as you can see here, a fairly formidable size and power. Now, I want you to notice and pay close attention what happens here. I want you to look to the western part of the empire. Of course, you see the Byzantine, the Byzantine parts of southern Italy, but also notice that red line on the far western half of the empire. And notice how Serbia and Croatia, totally shaded. They're not totally shaded as part of the Byzantine Empire. And I thought that was helpful for this map to point that out because what happens, Bulgaria is gone. They're completely subsumed into the empire. But that puts, at this point, the Byzantine Empire even further into the west. And so now, remember this old border here, east and west, going all the way back to the earlier periods of empire. You'll remember Croatia, modern-day Bosnia. These were all comfortably in the sphere of the western half. Illyricum, modern Serbia, which kind of straddled the border. Part of it was in, part of it was out, half east, half west, a little bit more east than west, but still. But now what you have is the Byzantine Empire sees these two kingdoms, Serbia and Croatia, in play, which causes the Patriarchate of Constantinople to see their episcopates in play as well. And as we will see next time, the Patriarch of Constantinople is effectively an arm of the empire that he would use to further the interests of the states. The emperor would use to further the interests of the states. Rather, really, than any strong religious conviction, it was more about what is best for the empire. And they would, kind of callously, effectively, at times, use the religious arm to help further those ends. So now Croatia is the de facto border between the Byzantine Empire and the Holy Roman Empire. And as you can imagine, this suddenly gives Croatia a lot more leverage than they had before. In the ensuing struggle, the Croats decided to stay with their historic alliance between East and West. They decided to stay with Rome. Now, when I say leverage, though, when I say decide, I want to be clear that in many ways, these people, especially of the Kingdom of Croatia and Serbia, up until the point of their being conquered, I would include the Bulgarians in here as well. These people were more than just mere vassals or satellites between two rival powers. They had interests of their own. And I want to be clear that so that when you're reviewing these things, especially if you're doing so from a apologetical perspective, that you're aware, no matter which side you find them on today. We tend to have what's called a hindsight bias, but at the time, none of it was a given that Bulgaria or Serbia or Croatia, etc., would go either east or west. It's all kind of at play here. And oftentimes, the rulers of the moment were thinking about the interests, their own specific interests, and that's which way that would determine which way that they would side with these things. So don't think of these vassal powers as mere pawns to the larger powers. At times they have their own interests, and if they had skilled enough rulers, the rulers, such as we saw with Boris the First, were at times able to play the more extremely powerful players against each other to his own advantage. Now, I think a good illustration of sort of the tensions that are arising here and how Croatia ends up within the sphere of Rome is what's known as the Synods of Split. Called in 925 by Pope John X, here they worked out that the Latins would be excuse me, here they worked out that Latin would be the preferred liturgical language over the Slavic. They negotiated diocesan boundaries. They have a general trend towards Roman disciplines and authority. But later, there was another one convened by the Bishop of Nin, who his name is Gregory, Bishop Gregory. He felt that his diocese wasn't properly listed among the ancients at 925. So again, as always, there are these you can't just ignore these people completely, right? They weren't just subservient people. These ideas hadn't been completely, I think, formulated, especially in disputed territories where the emergence of the episcopate is coming for the first time. These people, like the Bishop of Nin, he would let his grievances known. Now, a little further east, while I think Croatia, the history of the region and of the kingdom is clearly within Western jurisdiction. A little further east, we have the issue of Serbia, and even more complicated than Croatia. Serbia was first evangelized by Rome and was under her jurisdiction until the ninth century. And as you can imagine, even before the annexation of Bulgaria, Serbia is increasingly caught in the East-West conflict. The conflict of this leads the rulers of Serbia to see it in their interest to side with the Byzantines against the Bulgarians. Now, Bulgaria at this time is at war with Byzantium, so keep that in mind. Bulgaria is also an enemy to Serbia. I don't want to play this as if Serbia is mere pawns to the Byzantine Empire here. I don't think that's the case. But with that said, the Patriarchate of Constantinople is definitely going to try to maneuver itself into the sphere of influence and to overtake the Serbian church. This is a long-standing reputation that Constantinople has. Just ask the Bulgarians and the Russians today about it if you think I'm making it up. So it's not mere Roman polemics for me to point this out here. The Byzantine Empire sees its political borders as its religious borders. So therefore, you have an increasing audacity of the ecumenical patriarchs. It's not so much that the ecumenical patriarchs are doing anything other than promoting and pushing the sphere of the Byzantine state, which they see it as part of their job, their duty to do. So what happens is that when Basil II conquers Bulgaria, he declares the established autocephalous Church of Bulgaria void. He downgrades it to an archbishopric under the Patriarch of Constantinople and also moves its location from the far, far northeast of Bulgaria and Drastar to Ohrid in the southwest of Macedonia. And we'll discuss that more in a bit. But somewhere around this point, we see the first mentions of a bishopric of Serbia, which in the emperor's eyes would be under the new archbishopric of Ohrid. So that's sort of where the Serbian church, and the Serbian church is going to have its own history moving into the events after the Great Schism, but that's how the Serbian church sort of comes into the sphere of the Byzantine Empire. Now, Rome does make overtures at this point to bring Serbia back into the fold, but increasingly she's politically under the sphere of Byzantium and hence under the sphere of the ecumenical patriarch. Now, I, of course, have a whole video on the pornocracy papacy. You can find it on my members' videos on YouTube or on my Patreon channel. But to surmise, it is not a great time for Rome politically. From the 860s to the 950s, roughly, really all the way up to the ascendancy of Pope Leo IX. But it's a fairly dark time, and it's mainly dark because the papacy becomes so embroiled in local factionalism that she tends to be unable to be as involved in the universal concerns that had been her concerns up to that point and would become her concerns later. We see the culmination of the ancient papacy, the pre-Charlemagne, or excuse me, the pre-pornocracy papacy and Pope Saint Nicholas the Great, right? This is this period of strong papal prerogatives. The papacy is sort of standing for itself very strongly. And then we see this slow descent to where when the Theophylact family in Rome sort of takes power and you don't have the papacy's not doesn't really have a protectorate in the Holy Roman Empire. At the time, it's mainly just controlled by these families in Rome. So you see, for example, Pope Stephen VI calls the infamous Cadaver Synod, where they exhume the the body of former Pope Formosius. You have as well just some of the more, I mean, there's a whole laundry list of just bad popes at this time, but just to illustrate, we have Pope John the 12th dies by defenestration when supposedly he was caught by a married woman's husband, and the husband was not too keen on catching him and throws him out of a window. But as well, during this time, we have the 10th century Benedictine monastic reforms of Cluny, which are taking place. Again, I have a series of videos on that. Go watch those. But by 1059, one of the reforming popes who was trying to, these men were trying to call the church back to her ancient self. And Pope Leo IX was the first of these reforming men to be elevated to the position of pope. We're going to discuss that more in depth next week, but it's important just to kind of see the trajectory of these things over time. Now, throughout all of this, the mood between Rome and Constantinople kind of waxes and wanes. From the time of Nicholas and Photius up to the schism, there's moments of cordiality between the two, and then there's some tenuous moments as well. Especially as we get closer to the events of 1054, things become a little bit more tenuous. For example, Eustathius of Constantinople makes something of an overture, backed by a little bit of money, to quell some of the disputes, offering John the 19th a compromise of having the Eastern Patriarch oversee his own sphere while Rome would quote unquote rule over the universal sphere, though that was mainly as far as Anasius was concerned, was a like diplomatic title. And of course, Rome, even in the worst period of the Roman pornocracy, Rome never lost sense of her place in the worldwide church. She just became so focused on the insular problems of the church that she was unable to sort of tend to these wider things that were taking place. So As a teaser, we're going to talk more about the specifics of this in the next lecture. But for now, just keep in mind that the feeling, while not terrible throughout the entire century leading up to 1054, it's also not great. All right, so we have established at this point, generally speaking, two land disputes, one in southern Italy and one along the east-west border of Illyricum. And this sort of sets the two stages that are going to take us right to 1054. And I want to spend some time here on the more immediate conflict surrounding 1054, which is the issue of southern Italy. So in the year 1000, southern Italy was sort of a hodgepodge of principalities, as you can see here. Most prominent of which, of course, would have been the Byzantine Empire's lands, but you also had the principalities of Salerno, of Benevento, and some other ones. In the year 1050, though, the Normans land. And what can we say about the Normans that hasn't already been said? I mean, in some ways, they are like the last of the old barbarian raiders. They come from that old Norse Viking stock. Most of the people, certainly a people like the Byzantines who considered themselves Roman, or the Italian people would have considered the Normans just absolute like trash. Like just very violent men with swords and not much else. And for a few centuries at this point, they've been mingling with Christian civilization. Several of their Norman rulers have converted. They've come under the belt of Christianity in name, if not always in practice. So even though you might have been dealing with Christian Norsemen at this time, it didn't do a lot of good for their neighbors or for anyone that these Norsemen laid their sights on. And in the mid 11th centuries, they had their sights on Italy. Norman Robert Guiscard starts conquering southern Italy. He takes Salerno, he takes Calabria, he takes Apulia. Emperor Constantine the Ninth, emperor of the Byzantine Empire. Interestingly, as you can imagine, the empire has some real vested interest in seeing the Normans fail in their endeavors. So interestingly, the emperor here wants to ally in a way that they hadn't in recent decades with the papacy against this common enemy, the Normans. Now, the problem, though, is that while Basil II had left the treasury well off, he'd kind of left the state in an unstable position, and you have this series of problems with the Byzantine emperors in the Byzantine dynasty at this point. Following the Byzantine dynasty, if you guys just enjoy machinations and confusion and which Michael are we talking about again? Like you will enjoy studying the history of the Byzantine dynasties. If you are, I would recommend a fantastic book, A History of the Byzantine State by George Ostrogorsky or Gorsky. If you're interested in that, he's got a wonderful classic book on that subject. But that's sort of where we're at right now. And the empire, the emperor, he's looking wherever he can to find allies wherever he can because he's got trouble all over. So Pope Leo the Ninth tries to head off the Normans and is captured and held prisoner in Benevento. Byzantium loses even more territory when they lose Trani, and it falls to the Normans under Peter II. And in a something of a stabilizing moment, we have Guiscard turns to the papacy as an ally. Though for the sake of our discussion today, it was too little too late as it that takes place after the series of events that has already going to begun that affects what happens in 1054. Now turning back for a moment to the east. Remember we said that Bulgaria has now been demolished. It's been humiliated and it's conquered by Byzantium. And unlike, say, the Croats or the Serbs, which still maintain some powers of leverage, Bulgaria is basically a vassal state. And remember as well, we said that the emperor liked to use the Patriarch of Constantinople to leverage state power. Well, such is the case for the church in Bulgaria at this time. And to review this, what happens is so the in 925 the Bulgarian church is established. And there are overtures by Simeon the First, ruler of Bulgaria, toward Rome under Pope John X. Initially, what happens is Bulgaria as an empire is granted autocephaly. They're granted the privileges of being a patriarchate. So you have the Patriarchate of Bulgaria, and they are an independent church. They are not seen as under Constantinople's influence or domain or jurisdiction. And Constantinople doesn't like that. Constantinople has its sights politically and religiously on Bulgaria. So when Emperor Basil II takes over and conquers Bulgaria, he demotes them. He actually demotes an autocephalous church to an archbishopric. So, in that sense, so much for, autocephaly being what defines the limits of a church, because we know that these autocephalous churches, as far as the emperor was concerned, are just mere political political tools that he can create or dispense with as his needs may be. And this leads to a series in the same way that there was sort of a quote unquote captivity of the Roman papacy for a couple centuries. This leads to a successive series of archbishops of Ohrid that are Byzantine. Now, unlike the issue with the papacy, when these popes were appointed by the emperor during this time that we call the Byzantine captivity, Rome's pretty far from Constantinople, and the popes had a lot more leverage. And the popes, those Greek-speaking popes, used that distance to help leverage their political and their religious position. Just all you have to do is turn to the issues with Pope Agathos, for example, to see an example of that. Not so for the poor Archbishop of Ohrid, who is right there under the boot heel of the Byzantine Empire. And so they are, much like the state had become, the Church of Bulgaria becomes a vassal to the Patriarch of Constantinople. And this isn't a popular thing. Like, don't think that this is like a wave of popular support. Like, this is a top-down policy. In 1040, after the death of Basil II, Bulgaria went into rebellion. One of the grievances of the rebel leaders, Peter Dalon, is that the captivity of their episcopate by the Byzantines is unbearable for them. So that's just sort of an aside to show you that this is an unpopular, hostile occupation. As well, there are other uprisings in 1066, 1071, and 1079. So as all of these events are taking place in Italy, it's like a Norman Armageddon over in Italy. The papacy is in captivity. The Pope is literally being held captive and held for leverage for the Normans. One principality after another is falling to the sword of the Normans. It's a nightmare situation, and in the middle of this, in the midst of it, a letter arrives. And the letter is from this man, Leo of Ohrid. Leo is a Byzantine. He was the ecclesial administrator in the Hagia Sophia, and he's appointed by the emperor as Archbishop of Ohrid in 1037. And he sends letters to southern Italy, some specifically addressed to the Pope himself, with the approval of the ecumenical patriarch, And one of these letters lands in the hands of a cardinal working in southern Italy by the name of Humbert of Silva Candida. And it's this letter given to this man at this time that was going to lead us directly to the road to 1054. But in order to discuss that, you're going to have to tune in next time. Today we were focused on the land disputes and the situation around southern Italy and the situation around modern day Balkans, Bulgaria, Serbia, modern day Bosnia and Croatia, and all that happened there that set the stage for the events that would happen in 1054. So tune in next time as we discuss the fight for faith. Until then, please like and subscribe. Hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you next time. God bless.